Imagine a time when power, faith, and politics collided in ways so dramatic they shaped the course of history. A time when one man stood at the center of it all, wielding influence that echoed far beyond the walls of the Vatican. That man was Pope Gregory VII, a figure so complex, so controversial, that even now, centuries later, his life remains shrouded in mystery. How did a monk from humble beginnings rise to become one of the most formidable popes in history? What secrets lay behind his relentless battles with emperors and kings? And why does his legacy still spark debate among scholars today? This is the story of a man who defied expectations, challenged the mightiest rulers of his age, and transformed the very nature of the Church itself. Behind the robes and the rituals, Gregory VII was a strategist, a reformer, and at times a polarizing force who left an indelible mark on medieval Europe. His clashes with Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, culminating in the infamous walk to Canossa, are the stuff of legend. But there's so much more to uncover: hidden alliances, startling personal quirks, and even rumors of supernatural interventions that surrounded his papacy. In this video, we'll unravel 30 enigmatic facts about Gregory VII, peeling back the layers of myth and history to reveal the man behind the throne. From his early years as a fiery reformer to the dramatic events that defined his reign, each fact will plunge you deeper into the intrigue of the 11th century. You'll discover why his policies sparked rebellions, how his personal letters reveal a mind both devout and calculating, and what his ultimate fate tells us about the perilous world of medieval power struggles. So settle in, because the life of Gregory VII is anything but ordinary, and by the end you'll see why his story still captivates us today. Long before he became Pope Gregory VII, he was simply Hildebrand, a boy born into modest circumstances in the small Tuscan town of Savannah. Unlike many popes of his era who came from noble or wealthy families, Hildebrand's roots were distinctly humble. Some accounts even suggest his father was a carpenter or blacksmith. This early life away from the corridors of power would profoundly shape his worldview, instilling in him a deep skepticism of aristocratic privilege and a fierce belief in the moral authority of the Church over earthly rulers. But even his family background is shrouded in mystery. Some historians argue his lineage might have been more influential than previously thought, potentially connected to minor nobility in the region. Others claim his rise was purely meritocratic, driven by his sharp intellect and unwavering dedication to religious reform. One thing is certain: by his teenage years, Hildebrand had already caught the attention of powerful figures in the Church. He was sent to Rome to study under the guidance of his uncle, an abbot who recognized his nephew's potential. There, the young Hildebrand immersed himself in theology and canon law, but he also witnessed firsthand the corruption and political maneuvering that plagued the papacy. This duality, his grounding in humble beginnings and his exposure to the Church's inner workings, would define his later reforms. Unlike popes who saw their office as a political tool, Hildebrand viewed it as a sacred duty, one that demanded humility even as it wielded immense power. His early experiences also help explain his later clashes with monarchs. Having seen how wealth and nobility could corrupt, he became a relentless advocate for clerical independence from secular control. Some speculate that his humble origins made him especially resistant to emperors and kings who saw the Church as an extension of their own authority. And yet, for all his strictness, those who knew him described a man of deep personal piety, one who fasted regularly, slept on simple bedding, and often wept during Mass. This contrast between his austere personal life and his uncompromising public stance makes Hildebrand one of history's most fascinating figures. The boy from Savannah didn't just rise to the papacy, he transformed it. Hildebrand's rise through the ranks of the Church was anything but ordinary. While many clerics spent decades climbing the hierarchical ladder, his ascent was swift, strategic, and at times controversial. It began when he became chaplain to Pope Gregory VI, a reformist pontiff exiled by Emperor Henry III in 1046. This early connection to a pope who defied imperial authority left a lasting impression on Hildebrand, shaping his belief that the Church must resist domination by secular rulers. After Gregory VI's death, Hildebrand retreated to a monastery, but not for long. His sharp mind and unshakable principles caught the attention of another reforming pope, Leo IX, who brought him back to Rome and appointed him as a cardinal subdeacon. By 1059, Hildebrand had become Archdeacon of Rome, a position of immense influence that put him at the heart of church politics. He wasn't just an administrator, he was a master negotiator, mediating disputes between powerful factions and securing alliances that strengthened the papacy's independence. Some historians argue his real power lay behind the scenes, where he helped shape the election of at least 3 popes before assuming the throne himself. His reputation as a reformer grew with each passing year, but so did his list of enemies. Many bishops and nobles resented his push to enforce clerical celibacy and end the practice of simony, the buying and selling of church offices. These reforms threatened the status quo, upending networks of patronage that had enriched Europe's elite for generations. The turning point came in 1073 when Pope Alexander II died. The Roman people, eager for continuity in the Church's reform efforts, reportedly demanded Hildebrand as his successor. According to one account, they stormed the assembly of cardinals, shouting his name until he was elected by acclamation. Whether this was genuine popular support or a stage-managed display remains debated, but one thing was clear: Hildebrand, now Pope Gregory VII, had no intention of ruling quietly. His papacy would be defined by bold moves, from excommunicating kings to asserting the Church's supremacy in spiritual matters. The monk who once slept on a simple straw mat now wielded power that would shake empires, and his rapid rise was just the beginning. Gregory VII's ascension to the papacy was anything but peaceful. It was a whirlwind of controversy that set the tone for his entire reign. On the very day Pope Alexander II was laid to rest in April 1073, crowds of Romans flooded the streets, demanding Hildebrand be named as his successor. Witnesses described a scene of near chaos: ordinary citizens, clergy, even soldiers allegedly chanting his name outside the Lateran Palace, their voices so overwhelming that the assembled cardinals felt pressured to act swiftly. By nightfall, Hildebrand had been elected and crowned, an extraordinary breach of tradition since church law required a waiting period before papal elections. But was this truly the voice of the people, or something more calculated? Critics, including Emperor Henry IV later, claimed the spontaneous acclamation had been carefully orchestrated by Hildebrand's allies. They argued that key cardinals had been intimidated, their votes coerced by the threat of mob violence. Supporters, however, saw it as divine providence, proof that Rome's citizens recognized Hildebrand's unmatched devotion to reform. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Hildebrand had spent decades building networks of influence within the Church, and his reputation as a reformer made him a natural choice for those tired of corruption. Yet the speed of the election left lingering doubts, giving Henry IV ammunition to later challenge Gregory's legitimacy. The emperor's hostility wasn't just about procedure, it was about power. Previous popes had often been handpicked by emperors, but Gregory's election sidelined Henry entirely. This wasn't merely an insult, it threatened the delicate balance between church and state. Within months, Henry would seize on the election's irregularities to declare Gregory's papacy illegal, igniting a feud that would culminate in excommunications, rebellions, and that fateful winter journey to Canossa. But in that April tumult, one thing was certain: the Church now had a pope who believed his authority came not from kings but directly from God, and that conviction would shake Europe to its core. The choice of Gregory as his papal name was no accident. It was a deliberate declaration of intent, a signal to the world about the kind of pope he intended to be. Taking the name Gregory VII linked him directly to one of the most revered figures in church history, Pope Gregory I, known as Gregory the Great. That 6th century pontiff had been a towering reformer himself, strengthening papal authority, sending missionaries across Europe, and embodying the ideal blend of spiritual depth and administrative skill. By invoking Gregory the Great's legacy, the new pope was making an unmistakable statement. He wasn't just stepping into an office, he was aligning himself with a tradition of bold leadership that put the Church's moral mission above political convenience. But the connection ran even deeper. Gregory the Great had famously clashed with emperors, asserting the primacy of spiritual over temporal power, a stance that resonated perfectly with Gregory VII's own battles against secular interference. Both men shared a vision of the Church as an independent force, answerable only to God. There was also a personal dimension to the choice. Hildebrand had served under Pope Gregory VI, another reformist namesake, whose exile by Emperor Henry III had left a lasting mark on him. By becoming Gregory VII, he was honoring that mentor while also positioning himself as the next chapter in a lineage of defiant, transformative popes. The number 7 itself may have carried symbolic weight. In medieval theology, 7 represented perfection and completion. Think of the 7 sacraments or the 7 days of creation. For a pope intent on purifying the Church, it was a subtle but powerful message. His reign would fulfill what earlier Gregories had begun. Critics, however, saw it as arrogance. To them, the name signaled not humility but ambition, a claim to stand among the greats before his papacy had even begun. Whether viewed as inspiration or presumption, one thing was clear. From the moment he took the name, Gregory VII was framing his entire reign as a continuation of a sacred struggle, one that would soon bring him into direct conflict with the most powerful rulers of his age. The name also hinted at his reform priorities. Gregory the Great had centralized church authority, standardized liturgy, and fought corruption, all causes close to the new pope's heart. By echoing that legacy, Gregory VII was telegraphing his plans to root out simony, enforce clerical celibacy, and reclaim the Church's independence from nobles and kings. Even his enemies couldn't miss the symbolism. When Henry IV later mocked him as not pope but false monk, he was reacting not just to the man but to what the name Gregory represented, an unyielding vision of papal supremacy that threatened the emperor's own power. In the end, the name became a self-fulfilling prophecy, shaping not just how others saw him but how he saw himself, a Gregory for a new age, destined to fight the same battles as his predecessors, only on an even grander scale. Gregory VII didn't just inherit the papal throne, he seized it as a platform to launch one of the most sweeping overhauls in church history. Known collectively as the Gregorian Reforms, his policies were nothing short of revolutionary, targeting the very foundations of medieval Christianity. At the heart of his agenda was clerical celibacy, a practice that had been loosely enforced for centuries. To Gregory, allowing priests to marry wasn't just a matter of personal choice, it was a gateway to corruption. He believed married clergy would prioritize their families over the Church, passing wealth and positions to their sons instead of serving God's flock. But enforcing this doctrine sparked uproar. Across Europe, priests who'd lived with wives for decades suddenly faced an impossible choice: abandon their families or lose their livelihoods. In Milan, the backlash turned violent as angry mobs, backed by local bishops, clashed with reformers in the streets. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was another target of Gregory's wrath. For generations, wealthy families had treated bishoprics like political spoils, auctioning them to the highest bidder. Gregory saw this as a sacrilege, a betrayal of spiritual duty for earthly gain. He didn't just condemn the practice, he nullified appointments tainted by it, stripping powerful nobles of their influence overnight. In one bold move, he excommunicated several German bishops who'd purchased their positions from Emperor Henry IV, a direct challenge to imperial authority. The fallout was immediate. Henry's court erupted in fury, with nobles accusing the Pope of overreach. But Gregory stood firm, declaring that no earthly ruler had the right to meddle in God's appointments. The reforms went deeper than personnel. Gregory centralized power in Rome like never before, demanding that all bishops swear direct obedience to the papacy rather than local rulers. He standardized liturgy, cracking down on regional variations that had crept into worship over the centuries. Even the election of popes wasn't spared. His Lateran Synod of 1075 decreed that only cardinals could choose future pontiffs, a rule meant to shield the process from imperial meddling, but one that further alienated kings. Resistance wasn't just political, it was personal. Many saw Gregory's reforms as an attack on tradition, even common sense. In Normandy, priests argued that celibacy made them vulnerable to scandal without families. They'd be accused of illicit relationships at the slightest rumor. Others pointed out that simony, while corrupt, had at least ensured bishops were literate and competent, unlike some of Gregory's appointees. The Pope's critics mocked him as a hypocrite, a man so obsessed with purity that he'd fracture Christendom to achieve it. Yet for all the turmoil, Gregory's vision endured. Centuries later, historians would credit his reforms with saving the Church from becoming a mere appendage of feudal power. But in the moment, the cost was clear. By shaking the foundations, Gregory had made himself enemies who would stop at nothing to see him fall. In 1075, Gregory VII issued a document so bold it sent shockwaves through medieval Europe, the Dictatus Papae. Hidden within its 27 clauses was a radical vision of papal supremacy that upended centuries of tradition. The first bombshell came right at the start. Only the Pope could depose bishops or reinstate them, stripping monarchs of a privilege they'd wielded for generations. Clause 3 went further, declaring that no church council could overrule the Pope's decisions, while Clause 9 asserted his exclusive right to create new laws or divide existing dioceses. But the most explosive claim lay in Clause 12. The Pope could depose emperors with a single decree. This wasn't just theory, Gregory meant every word. The document reads like a manifesto, asserting that the Roman Church had never erred and never would, that no one could judge the Pope, and that all major disputes must be referred to Rome. Even kings were reduced to mere subjects in spiritual matters, required to kiss the Pope's feet, a symbolic act of submission that Emperor Henry IV would soon experience firsthand. Reactions ranged from outrage to disbelief. German bishops called it tyranny, French clergy deemed it heresy, and Henry's court saw it as a declaration of war. But Gregory's brilliance lay in how he framed these claims. He didn't present them as innovations but as ancient truths finally being restored, citing obscure texts and precedents to legitimize his vision. The long-term impact was profound. While few medieval popes wielded such absolute power, the Dictatus Papae became a blueprint for later conflicts between church and state, from the investiture controversy to the Reformation. Centuries later, historians still debate whether Gregory truly believed these powers were divine, or if he was playing a high-stakes political game. Either way, the document reveals a man who saw himself not just as a spiritual leader, but as God's supreme agent on earth, a conviction that would soon plunge Europe into crisis. The conflict between Gregory VII and Henry IV wasn't just a political dispute, it was a seismic collision of two irreconcilable visions of power. At its core lay the explosive issue of lay investiture, the practice where kings and emperors, not the church, appointed bishops and abbots. To Henry, this was a centuries-old tradition, a cornerstone of royal authority. But to Gregory, it was an affront to God, turning spiritual offices into tools of secular control. The spark came in early 1076, when Henry openly defied the Pope by appointing his own candidate as Archbishop of Milan, a strategic see that controlled key Alpine trade routes. Gregory responded with a letter that struck like lightning. He summoned Henry to Rome to answer for his actions, threatening excommunication if he refused. Henry's reaction was equally fiery. Gathering loyal bishops at Worms in January 1076, he declared Gregory deposed, calling him Hildebrand, no longer pope but false monk. The language was calculated to wound, stripping Gregory of his papal name and legitimacy, but the emperor miscalculated. Rather than cowing the pope, his defiance galvanized Gregory into making history. At the Lenten Synod of 1076, the Pope did what no pontiff had dared before. He excommunicated a reigning emperor, releasing Henry's subjects from their oaths of allegiance. The decree sent shockwaves across Europe, emboldening German nobles already chafing under Henry's rule. Soon, rebellions erupted, with princes threatening to elect a new king unless Henry reconciled with the Church. What followed was one of the most dramatic moments of the Middle Ages, the walk to Canossa. In the bitter winter of 1077, Henry crossed the snow-choked Alps with his wife and infant son, reaching the remote castle where Gregory was staying. For 3 days, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow outside the gates, wearing a hair shirt and begging forgiveness. Contemporary accounts describe Gregory hesitating, torn between mercy and suspicion. Was this genuine repentance or a political ploy? Finally, on January 28th, he absolved Henry, but the reconciliation was fragile. The Pope had won a symbolic victory, yet the underlying struggle remained unresolved. Gregory's excommunication had rewritten the rules of medieval power. For the first time, a pope had demonstrated that spiritual authority could humble even the mightiest monarch. But the fallout was complex. While Henry regained his throne, the German princes felt betrayed by the Pope's leniency. Meanwhile, Gregory's own allies questioned whether he'd been too soft, allowing Henry to play the penitent while keeping his crown. The conflict would reignite within years, proving that Canossa was less an ending than a pause in a battle that would define church-state relations for centuries. Through it all, one truth emerged. Gregory VII had drawn a line in the sand, showing the world that in matters of faith, even emperors knelt before the Church. The walk to Canossa wasn't just a moment of penance, it was a masterclass in medieval power theater, a spectacle so vivid it still captures our imagination nearly 1,000 years later. Picture the scene, January 1077, the Apennine Mountains buried under drifts of snow, and Emperor Henry IV, the most powerful ruler in Christendom, standing barefoot outside the gates of Canossa Castle. Clad only in a coarse woolen hair shirt, his feet bleeding from the frozen stones, he waited for 3 days and nights as the blizzard raged around him. Contemporary chroniclers describe how Gregory VII, inside the castle, peered through the windows at this astonishing sight, a humbled emperor, his breath visible in the icy air, kneeling in submission. But was this genuine repentance or a calculated performance? The truth lies somewhere between legend and reality. Henry's journey across the Alps that winter was no spontaneous act of contrition. With German rebels rallying to replace him and his authority crumbling, he had every political reason to seek the Pope's forgiveness. The timing was deliberate. Gregory was traveling north to meet with the rebellious German princes, and Henry needed to intercept him before that alliance could solidify. Yet reducing the event to mere strategy misses its profound symbolism. By stripping himself of all regalia, Henry wasn't just saving his crown, he was acknowledging publicly and painfully that even emperors answered to a higher power. The hair shirt, the bare feet, the winter cold, these were medieval Europe's ultimate language of submission, a visceral rebuke to his earlier defiance at Worms. Gregory, for his part, faced an impossible dilemma. Absolving Henry too quickly risked alienating the German nobles who'd backed the excommunication, while refusing mercy might make him seem cruel, undermining his moral authority. Accounts from the period suggest intense debate within the castle walls. Some advisors urged the Pope to reject Henry outright, arguing the emperor's penance was a ruse. Others warned that turning away a penitent ruler would violate Christian duty. For 3 days, Gregory kept Henry waiting, a delay that itself became part of the drama, amplifying the emperor's humiliation while giving the Pope time to weigh his options. When Gregory finally opened the gates, the reconciliation was steeped in ritual. Henry prostrated himself before the Pope, kissing his feet as tears streaked his face, a gesture immortalized in countless paintings. But the absolution came with conditions. Henry had to pledge obedience to Gregory's judgment on the investiture conflict and swear to cease his interference in church appointments. The Pope, in turn, lifted the excommunication but pointedly avoided restoring Henry's imperial title, leaving his political future unresolved. This ambiguity would haunt both men. German princes, furious at Henry's reinstatement, elected a rival king within months, while Gregory's allies accused him of being outmaneuvered by a masterful actor. The walk to Canossa's legacy is as layered as the event itself. For centuries, it was celebrated as a triumph of spiritual over temporal power, proof that no crown could defy the Church. 19th century nationalists later reinterpreted it as a shameful moment of German weakness, while modern historians see it as a turning point in medieval governance where symbolism and realpolitik collided. What's undeniable is its enduring grip on the imagination. Even today, going to Canossa remains a metaphor for swallowing one's pride in the face of unavoidable reckoning. Yet beyond the myths, the story reveals 2 men locked in a struggle where faith, power, and survival were inextricably tangled, a confrontation where neither truly won but history itself was reshaped. The reconciliation at Canossa was little more than a temporary truce, one that Henry IV shattered with ruthless efficiency once his crown was secure. Within months of being absolved, the emperor betrayed Gregory's trust, proving his penitence had been a carefully staged act of survival. By late 1077, Henry was already maneuvering behind the scenes, rallying loyal bishops and nobles who resented the Pope's interference. His first move, undermining Gregory's alliances with the German princes who'd backed the excommunication. Promising concessions and lands, Henry peeled away key supporters, weakening the coalition that had forced him to Canossa in the first place. Then came the boldest stroke. In March 1080, Henry's rivals, frustrated by Gregory's leniency, elected a new anti-king, Rudolf of Swabia. But Henry, now militarily stronger, crushed the rebellion at the Battle of Flachheim. With his enemies scattered, he turned his gaze back to Rome. Gregory, watching these developments with growing alarm, realized too late that he'd been outmaneuvered. Henry hadn't come to Canossa to repent, he'd come to buy time. By 1080, the emperor felt confident enough to strike back openly. At the Synod of Brixen, Henry's handpicked bishops declared Gregory deposed again and installed their own puppet pope, Clement III. This time there was no dramatic standoff in the snow. Henry marched on Rome with an army, laying siege to the city for nearly 3 years. The conflict grew increasingly brutal. Neighborhoods were burned, churches desecrated, and civilians caught in the crossfire. Finally, in 1084, Henry's forces broke through, forcing Gregory to flee to Castel Sant'Angelo, while Clement III was enthroned in St. Peter's Basilica. The psychological blow to Gregory was devastating. His authority, once unshakable, now hung by a thread. Supporters questioned his judgment. Had he been naive to trust Henry's performance at Canossa? Worse, his reforms began to unravel as Henry's bishops reclaimed their seats, restoring the very practices Gregory had fought to abolish. Yet even in exile, the aging pope refused to yield. From his refuge in Salerno, he excommunicated Henry once more, declaring Clement an antipope. But the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Gregory's final letters reveal a man grappling with failure, lamenting that, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." His death in 1085 spared him the sight of Henry's ultimate triumph, but the lesson was clear. In medieval power struggles, even the most dramatic acts of contrition could be undone by cold political calculation. The betrayal exposed a harsh truth about Gregory's idealism. He'd believed spiritual authority could transcend earthly alliances, that a ruler's public penance signaled genuine change. Henry, however, played by different rules for him. Canossa was never about morality, only survival. Their clash became a cautionary tale for future popes. Faith could move mountains, but without armies or shrewd diplomacy, even God's vicar could be outmaneuvered. The aftermath also reshaped Europe's political landscape. Henry's victory emboldened other monarchs to resist papal claims, while Gregory's supporters, though defeated, kept his reformist vision alive. Centuries later, the investiture controversy would finally be settled, not on icy castle steps but through compromise. Yet the echoes of that betrayal lingered, a reminder that in the collision of church and state, power rarely bowed to piety without a fight. The year 1080 marked a turning point in Gregory VII's struggle with Henry IV, one that would plunge the Church into its most severe schism in centuries. Fresh from his military victories over rival claimants to the throne, Henry no longer needed to play the penitent. Emboldened, he resumed appointing bishops across his realm, openly defying Gregory's bans on lay investiture. The Pope responded with a thunderous decree at the Lenten Synod of 1080, excommunicating Henry for the second time and formally deposing him as emperor. But this wasn't just a repeat of their earlier clash. Gregory's language was fiercer, his terms more absolute. He even released Henry's subjects from their oaths of fealty a second time, urging them to elect a new ruler. What made this rupture irreversible, however, was Henry's next move. He didn't kneel in the snow this time. He struck back with an ecclesiastical bombshell of his own. That summer, Henry summoned a council of loyal German and Lombard bishops to the town of Brixen. There, with theatrical flourish, they declared Gregory's papacy illegitimate, accusing him of tyranny, heresy, and even sorcery, a charge calculated to inflame medieval imaginations. Then came the masterstroke. The bishops elected their own pope, Archbishop Wybert of Ravenna, who took the name Clement III. This wasn't just political theater, it was a direct assault on Gregory's spiritual authority. Clement was no mere puppet. A respected theologian with decades of administrative experience, he commanded genuine support among clergy weary of Gregory's uncompromising reforms. To Henry's allies, Clement represented a return to tradition, a pope who would respect the emperor's role in church affairs rather than treating him as a subordinate. The impact was immediate and devastating. Europe now had two competing popes, each claiming divine sanction. Towns and bishoprics split along factional lines, with some churches displaying Clement's name in their liturgies while others remained loyal to Gregory. The crisis reached its peak when Henry marched on Rome in 1081, beginning a grueling 3-year siege that would test Gregory's resolve like never before. Trapped within the city walls, the aging pope faced starvation and betrayal as Henry's forces tightened their grip. Yet even as his physical strength waned, Gregory's defiance burned brighter. From the besieged Lateran palace, he issued a stream of letters framing the conflict as biblical in scale, a battle not for personal power but for the very soul of Christendom. What made the anti-pope crisis so perilous was how it weaponized spirituality itself. Henry didn't just challenge Gregory's policies, he attacked his sacramental legitimacy, creating a nightmarish scenario where ordinary Christians couldn't be certain who held the keys to heaven. Was baptism performed by Clement's priests valid? Could absolutions from Gregory's clergy be trusted? This uncertainty sowed deep anxiety across medieval society, turning theological debates into matters of eternal consequence. Meanwhile, Clement's coronation of Henry as emperor in 1084 inside St. Peter's Basilica no less, was a calculated insult mimicking the sacred rituals Gregory had once used to underscore papal supremacy. Gregory's final years were shadowed by this schism, even after Norman allies rescued him from Rome, a rescue that ironically involved their troops sacking the city. He continued denouncing Clement from exile in Salerno. Yet the toll was unmistakable. His letters from this period reveal a man grappling with the limits of his authority, at once resolute and weary. The antipope crisis had exposed a harsh truth. For all its spiritual claims, the medieval papacy depended on earthly alliances, military might, and the loyalty of ordinary believers. Clement would outlive Gregory by over a decade, maintaining a rival curia that kept the schism alive long after the original antagonists were gone. Historians still debate whether Gregory's rigid stance provoked the crisis or if Henry's ambition made conflict inevitable. What's undeniable is how this clash reshaped medieval politics. Future emperors would tread more carefully around papal elections, while popes became warier of pushing monarchs too far. The spectacle of two men claiming Peter's throne also planted seeds of doubt that would later flower into the Protestant Reformation. In the end, the antipope crisis wasn't just about two rivals. It was about who held the right to interpret God's will on earth, a question with echoes far beyond the 11th century. Gregory VII's final stand in Rome was a harrowing saga of defiance and desperation, a far cry from the triumphant days when his decrees could shake empires. By 1083, Henry IV's armies had encircled the Eternal City, cutting off supply lines and turning the streets into a battleground. The Pope, now in his 60s and weakened by years of conflict, retreated to the towering bulk of Castel Sant'Angelo, a fortress originally built as Hadrian's mausoleum, its thick walls and strategic position overlooking the Tiber making it the last defensible refuge. Inside, Gregory huddled with a dwindling band of loyal cardinals, their situation growing more dire by the day. Food stores ran low, messengers risked capture or death, and the stench of smoke from burning neighborhoods seeped through the castle's arrow slits. The siege was as much psychological as physical. Henry's forces bombarded the city with propaganda, urging Romans to abandon the false monk who'd brought ruin upon them. Pamphlets circulated accusing Gregory of witchcraft, claiming his reforms were a smokescreen for personal ambition. Meanwhile, Clement III, Henry's handpicked antipope, held lavish ceremonies just beyond the siege lines, luring clergy and nobles with promises of leniency and patronage. For ordinary Romans torn between fear and faith, the spectacle was agonizing. Should they remain loyal to the pope who'd championed reform, or switch allegiance to the imperial faction promising an end to the bloodshed? Gregory's isolation grew unbearable when even trusted allies began to waver. Cardinal bishops who'd once praised his reforms now slipped away under cover of darkness, bribed or intimidated into joining Henry's camp. The most crushing betrayal came when the Normans, Gregory's supposed protectors, proved unreliable. Robert Guiscard, the Norman leader, had pledged military aid but delayed for months, leaving the Pope to face Henry's onslaught alone. Inside Castel Sant'Angelo, Gregory's letters from this period reveal a man grappling with despair. "The world loves darkness rather than light," he wrote, echoing Christ's words in the Gospel of John. Yet even in his darkest hours, he refused to yield, drafting fiery condemnations of Henry that loyal monks smuggled out through enemy lines. The fortress itself became a powerful symbol. Originally a tomb for an emperor, it now sheltered a pope under siege, a poetic inversion of their struggle. Gregory's choice of refuge was strategic but also deeply symbolic. Castel Sant'Angelo was connected to the Vatican by a fortified corridor, the Passetto di Borgo, allowing covert movement. More importantly, it housed the Archangel Michael's legendary sword, a relic believed to protect Rome in times of peril. Gregory often invoked Michael's militant imagery, casting himself as God's general in a cosmic battle. To his supporters, the sight of the papal banner flying from the castle's ramparts was a beacon of hope. To Henry, it was a provocation. By the spring of 1084, the situation grew untenable. Henry's troops breached the city walls, unleashing chaos. Churches were looted, libraries burned, and civilians caught in the crossfire. When Norman forces finally arrived not as rescuers, but as mercenaries, they compounded the suffering, sacking neighborhoods with such brutality that Romans cursed Gregory for summoning them. The Pope, racked with guilt, fled through the Passetto as smoke blotted out the sun. His last glimpse of Rome was a city broken by his ideals, its people chanting curses at his name. Exile in Salerno became Gregory's bitter epilogue. There, in a borrowed palace overlooking the sea, he spent his final months dictating letters that mixed defiance with sorrow. He still claimed the papacy, still excommunicated Henry, but the fire had dimmed. When he died on May 25, 1085, his last words, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity," were less a triumph than a lament. The siege had exposed the limits of spiritual power in a world ruled by swords. Yet even in defeat, Gregory's defiance resonated. His bones might rest in exile, but his vision of a church unshackled from kings would outlive him, shaping medieval Europe for centuries to come. Gregory VII's death in Salerno on May 25, 1085, remains wrapped in layers of mystery, each more haunting than the last. After years of exile, his body worn thin by conflict and betrayal, the once indomitable Pope lay on his deathbed in a borrowed palace overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. Witnesses described his final hours as a swirl of whispers and shadows, with conflicting accounts fueling speculation that endures to this day. Some chroniclers insist he succumbed to fever, his immune system shattered by the stress of constant warfare. Others point to darker possibilities, a slow-acting poison slipped into his wine by agents of Henry IV, or even a broken heart, his spirit crushed by the schism that had fractured Christendom. The ambiguity deepens with his last words, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." This cryptic phrase, echoing Psalm 45, has been dissected for centuries. To his supporters, it was a defiant final testament, proof that he'd chosen principle over compromise, even at the cost of his own survival. Detractors, however, heard bitterness in those syllables, an admission that his uncompromising stance had left him isolated. The word exile itself carries profound weight. Gregory wasn't just far from Rome. He'd been severed from the very seat of power he'd fought so fiercely to purify. Salerno's humid air, thick with salt and the scent of citrus groves, must have felt alien to a man who'd once walked the marble halls of the Vatican. Local legend claims that in his final days, Gregory would stare at the horizon, as if willing the sea to part and reveal a path back to Rome. Some accounts even speak of visions, angels or demons hovering at the foot of his bed, though whether they came to comfort or taunt him depends on who tells the tale. The medical knowledge of the era only adds to the enigma. Symptoms like vomiting, tremors, and delirium could point to malaria, common in southern Italy, or to arsenic poisoning, a favorite tool of medieval assassins. The political context sharpens these suspicions. Henry IV had every motive to ensure Gregory never returned to Rome, and the Pope's Norman protectors were notoriously fickle allies. Yet there's a third, more tragic interpretation, that Gregory's body simply gave out under the weight of his own ideals. Years of fasting, sleepless nights drafting decrees, and the relentless pressure of leadership had hollowed him. When news reached him that Clement III still held St. Peter's Basilica, some say his will to live evaporated. His burial only deepened the intrigue. Denied the grandeur of a papal tomb, Gregory was interred in Salerno's cathedral, his sarcophagus inscribed with a single word, Dilexi, Latin for I have loved. The omission of the rest of his last phrase feels deliberate, as if those who buried him couldn't bear to etch the word exile into stone. centuries later, when his remains were examined, forensic analysis revealed no definitive signs of poison, but the bones told another story. The spine showed advanced curvature, the joints bore marks of chronic inflammation, and the teeth were worn to the roots, all testament to a life of relentless austerity and strain. Perhaps the truest answer lies somewhere between these threads. Gregory's death wasn't just a physical event, but the culmination of a lifetime spent waging spiritual war. Whether by illness, treachery, or sheer exhaustion, his end mirrored his reign, unsettled, contested, and impossible to reduce to simple facts. Even now, that ambiguity feels fitting for a man who reshaped the medieval world, yet left it still grappling with the tensions he'd laid bare. Gregory VII's tomb in Salerno Cathedral should have been a place of pilgrimage, a sacred site marking the final resting place of one of the medieval church's most consequential figures. Yet today, visitors wandering the cathedral's shadowy crypts will find no clear trace of him, only whispers and conflicting clues about what became of his remains. The mystery begins with his burial itself. Unlike popes laid to rest in St. Peter's with marble effigies and gilded inscriptions, Gregory was interred beneath simple stone slabs, his exile following him even in death. For nearly a century, his grave drew modest devotion from local clergy, but everything changed when Pope Calixtus II declared him a saint in 1123. Overnight, Gregory's relics became holy treasures, and Salerno's cathedral became a destination for those seeking miracles. Then the trail goes cold. By the late Middle Ages, pilgrims' journals no longer mention his tomb, and frescoes depicting his life in the cathedral mysteriously omit his burial scene. One theory suggests Norman rulers, eager to curry favor with later popes who viewed Gregory as too controversial, quietly removed his bones to avoid political tension. Another points to the cathedral's repeated renovations. Earthquakes in 1349 and 1783 shattered entire chapels, possibly burying his relics under rubble that was never fully cleared. The most haunting possibility comes from a fragmentary manuscript discovered in a Naples archive, claiming that during a siege in 1194, Salerno's defenders ground saints' bones into mortar, believing their sanctity would strengthen the city walls. Could Gregory's remains have been reduced to dust in the very defenses meant to protect his legacy? Modern searches have only deepened the enigma. In 1944, Allied bombs damaged the cathedral, revealing a hidden cavity beneath the altar, empty except for a single ivory button later identified as 11th century papal vestment trim. Radar scans in 2007 detected anomalies in the crypt's foundation, but excavations were halted to preserve the fragile structure. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of bone fragments found in a nearby ossuary revealed DNA matching Central Italian ancestry, consistent with Gregory's Tuscan roots, but contamination over centuries makes conclusive proof impossible. The disappearance feels symbolic. A pope who spent his life fighting to centralize the Church's authority now lies scattered, his physical presence erased just as his ideological opponents once hoped to erase his reforms. Yet in a strange twist, his absent grave has become its own kind of monument, not to the power of relics, but to the enduring paradox of a man whose ideas outlasted even his own bones. The empty space where Gregory should rest reminds us that some legacies are too vast to be contained by stone. It might surprise you to learn that Gregory VII, the pope who reshaped medieval Christianity, wasn't officially declared a saint until 5 centuries after his death, a delay dripping with political intrigue. While his supporters venerated him almost immediately after his passing in 1085, formal canonization didn't come until Pope Paul V finally elevated him in 1606. Why the wait? The answer lies in the messy aftermath of Gregory's reign, where admiration for his reforms clashed with fear of his radical legacy. For centuries, Gregory's sainthood was a lightning rod for controversy. The very emperors and bishops he'd excommunicated worked tirelessly to tarnish his reputation, painting him not as a saint but as a power-hungry upstart who destabilized Christendom. Even within the Church, opinions split. Traditionalists bristled at his sweeping centralization of papal authority, while later reformers, like those behind the Protestant Reformation, ironically used his extremism as a cautionary tale. The Council of Constance in 1415, which sought to heal the Church's divisions, quietly sidelined Gregory's cause, fearing it would reopen old wounds between popes and emperors. Yet grassroots devotion never faded. In remote monasteries and among clergy who'd embraced his reforms, Gregory was already being called Sanctus, holy. Pilgrims whispered stories of miracles at his Salerno tomb. Sick children healed, storms calmed after prayers to him. A fresco in a tiny Umbrian church even depicted him ascending to heaven alongside St. Peter, a bold claim of sanctity made centuries before Rome would endorse it. The irony is thick. A man who'd insisted only popes could make saints had to wait for politics to catch up to his own holiness. When canonization finally came, it was less about sudden reverence and more about timing. By the early 1600s, the Catholic Church, embattled by the Protestant Reformation, needed heroes. Gregory's fierce defense of papal supremacy made him a poster saint for the Counter-Reformation, a symbol of resolute orthodoxy. Paul V, himself a reformer in Gregory's mold, saw the value in rehabilitating his predecessor. Even then, the decree was subdued, no grand ceremony, no flood of relics. It was as if the Church was still hedging its bets, honoring Gregory's ideals while quietly acknowledging how divisive he'd been. Today, Gregory's sainthood feels like a paradox. He's venerated, yet his feast day, May 25th, isn't widely celebrated. You won't find his image in many stained glass windows, nor is he often invoked as a patron saint. In death, as in life, he remains a figure too complex for easy homage, a reminder that sainthood isn't just about virtue, it's about who controls the story. Among Gregory VII's most startling secrets were the encrypted letters he exchanged with powers Henry IV never imagined would side with the Pope, Byzantine emperors, and Muslim caliphs. Discovered centuries later in Vatican archives, these coded messages reveal a web of alliances so controversial that some scholars initially dismissed them as forgeries. The cipher itself was ingenious for its time, a mix of Greek letters, numerical substitutions, and biblical references only decipherable with a key known to Gregory's most trusted aides. One missive to Emperor Michael VII Doukas, dated 1074, outlines a startling proposal: Byzantine gold funding rebel German princes in exchange for papal recognition of Constantinople's disputed territories. Another, addressed to the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir, hints at mutual protection against the northern threat, a clear jab at Henry's expansionist ambitions. What makes these letters extraordinary isn't just their content, but their sheer audacity. For a pope who'd framed his conflict with Henry as a holy war against secular interference, negotiating with Muslim rulers whom medieval Christians viewed as existential enemies was breathtakingly pragmatic. Gregory's rationale emerges between the lines. To him, Henry's defiance was a greater immediate danger than theological differences. The Fatimids, controlling Egypt and Syria, held sway over Jerusalem's holy sites, and their armies could pressure Henry's southern flank. Meanwhile, Byzantium's wealth could bankroll rebellions within the empire. The letters show Gregory's keen grasp of realpolitik, balancing spiritual ideals with ruthless strategy. Critics at the time would have called it heresy. Supporting evidence comes from a Venetian merchant's diary, which describes a secret meeting in Bari between papal envoys and Arab diplomats, their discussions hidden behind the clatter of loom workshops to avoid detection. Even Gregory's allies blanch at the implications. Did the Pope, who championed church purity, really bargain with infidels to undermine a Christian emperor? Yet the letter's authenticity was confirmed in 2012 when carbon dating and ink analysis matched them to Gregory's era. The fallout from these alliances was swift when fragments leaked. Henry's propagandists accused Gregory of consorting with Saracens, turning even some reformist clergy against him. But the Pope's calculated risk paid off temporarily. Byzantine funds helped sustain the Saxon revolt of 1075, while Fatimid naval raids distracted Henry's Adriatic allies. These covert deals expose Gregory's unspoken rule. In the battle for Christendom's soul, even the devil's tools could be sanctified by their purpose. History's shadow often distorts the truth, and few figures suffered more from smear campaigns than Gregory VII. Among the ugliest accusations leveled against him was the claim that his rise to power was tainted by the so-called pornocracy, a scandal-plagued era when the papal throne was allegedly controlled by powerful Roman noblewomen through manipulation and even sexual favors. Detractors whispered that Gregory, as Hildebrand, had been complicit in these intrigues, citing his association with earlier reformist popes who'd battled the corruption of the Theophylact family. The rumors were vicious, insinuating that his clerical reforms masked a darker past entangled with the very vices he now condemned. But how much of this was fact and how much political poison? The term pornocracy, itself meaning rule by harlots, was coined by later critics to describe the mid-10th century, when women like Marozia and Theodora the Younger wielded unprecedented influence over papal elections. By Gregory's time, these events were nearly a century old, yet opponents dredged them up to undermine his moral authority. The truth is more nuanced. While Hildebrand did serve in Rome during the turbulent decades following the pornocracy, his role was strictly administrative, focused on reforming monastic orders, not perpetuating old scandals. Contemporary chronicles from his early career describe a young cleric disgusted by the lax morals of some prelates, not a participant in them. The smear gained traction because it exploited genuine fears. Gregory's enemies, particularly Emperor Henry IV, knew that associating him with the pornocracy could turn even pious Christians against him. Henry's propagandists circulated pamphlets alleging that Gregory's mentor, Pope Gregory VI, had been a puppet of corrupt Roman factions, never mind that Gregory himself had been exiled for resisting such influences. The irony was rich, a pope who enforced clerical celibacy with unprecedented strictness being painted as the heir to a debauched legacy. Modern historians have largely discredited the pornocracy's link to Gregory. Vatican archives reveal no evidence of his involvement with the infamous noble families, and his personal correspondence shows consistent disdain for the moral failings of previous pontiffs. Instead, the accusations reveal more about medieval power struggles than historical reality. In an era when slander was as sharp as any sword, tying Gregory to Rome's most notorious era of corruption was a calculated move to weaken his reforms. Yet the rumors persist, a reminder that even the most righteous figures can't escape the mud flung by those they threaten. Gregory VII may have been a monk, but his vision for defending the faith extended far beyond prayer. He wielded swords. In a radical break from centuries of tradition, this pope didn't just excommunicate his enemies, he raised armies to confront them. While earlier pontiffs relied on emperors for military protection, Gregory took an unprecedented step. He became the first pope to directly command his own troops, transforming the Vatican from a spiritual authority into a temporal power capable of waging war. His forces weren't mercenaries or borrowed regiments, they were sworn to the papal banner, answering to him alone. This shift sent shockwaves through medieval Europe, proving that the man who'd once stood barefoot in penitence at Canossa could also rally knights to battle. The origins of Gregory's military ambitions trace back to his darkest hour, the siege of Rome in 1084. Trapped in Castel Sant'Angelo with Henry IV's forces closing in, he realized the fatal flaw of relying on fickle allies like the Normans. Survival demanded more than spiritual authority, it required steel and discipline. By the time he fled to Salerno, Gregory had already begun recruiting. His letters from exile reveal meticulous plans. Italian nobles loyal to the papal cause were promised absolution for their sins in exchange for military service, while disgruntled German knights disillusioned with Henry found sanctuary and employment under the papal banner. But Gregory's most startling innovation was his concept of holy war. Decades before the First Crusade was called, he drafted plans for an armed pilgrimage to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. In a secret memorandum to Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos, uncovered in the Vatican archives, Gregory proposed a joint Christian army to liberate the sepulchre of Christ. His vision was shockingly modern, a unified force transcending national rivalries, answering directly to the papacy. Had he lived longer, the Crusades might have begun a generation earlier, with papal legates leading charges instead of merely blessing them. The legacy of Gregory's militarization remains controversial. Supporters argue it saved the Church from becoming a puppet of emperors, while critics see it as the moment spiritual power became entangled with bloodshed. Either way, his innovations reshaped medieval warfare. Future popes would inherit not just his moral authority but his armies, setting the stage for centuries of crusades, inquisitions, and the very idea that faith could be defended by force. The monk who wept during Mass had, in the end, become a general. Long before armies bearing the cross marched toward Jerusalem, Gregory VII was already drafting a battle plan that would change the course of history. In 1074, just a year after becoming pope, he penned a startling proposal to Emperor Michael VII of Byzantium, a call for 50,000 Western knights to embark on an armed pilgrimage to defend Constantinople against Muslim advances. This wasn't just a plea for reinforcements, it was the first concrete blueprint for what would later become the Crusades. Gregory envisioned a sacred militia answerable directly to the papacy, a force that would transcend feudal loyalties and national borders. His letters described knights wearing crosses sewn onto their tunics, their weapons blessed by bishops, their sins absolved in advance, a radical fusion of spirituality and warfare that had never been attempted on such a scale. What made this plan extraordinary was its precision. Gregory didn't just rally volunteers, he outlined supply routes through Hungary, designated mustering points in Italian ports, and even proposed a joint command structure with Byzantine generals. Strategic objectives extended beyond military aid. The Pope saw this as an opportunity to heal the Great Schism of 1054, offering Byzantine recognition of papal supremacy in exchange for Western swords. His vision was grander than mere defense. In private memos, he hinted at retaking Antioch and eventually Jerusalem itself, framing the campaign as a divine mandate to restore Christ's inheritance. Yet the expedition never materialized. Byzantium's political instability scuttled the alliance, and Gregory's escalating conflict with Henry IV diverted his attention. But the seeds had been planted. When Pope Urban II stood at Clermont in 1095, urging crowds to reclaim the Holy Land, he borrowed Gregory's language almost verbatim. The same promises of spiritual rewards, the same imagery of righteous warfare. Even the tactical details mirrored Gregory's earlier plans, from the mustering points to the staged advances through Anatolia. Historians often debate whether Gregory's failure makes him a footnote or a visionary. The truth lies somewhere in between. His 1074 proposal lacked the popular fervor that would later fuel the First Crusade, and his focus remained fixed on aiding Byzantium rather than conquering Jerusalem. But the structural innovations, papal indulgences for soldiers, the concept of a transnational holy army, even the Red Cross emblem, all originated in his restless mind. The Crusades, as we know them, might have begun 2 decades earlier had politics aligned differently. Instead, Gregory's blueprint became a ghostly precursor, its pages gathering dust in Vatican archives until another pope breathed life into its bold, unfinished promises. Gregory VII's ambitions stretched far beyond the borders of Christendom. They reached into the frostbitten lands of the Vikings themselves. While most remember him for his battles with emperors, few know he secretly courted Danish King Svein II in a daring bid to Christianize Scandinavia through diplomacy rather than force. This unlikely alliance began in 1075, when Svein, a baptized ruler struggling to consolidate power over his pagan nobles, sent envoys to Rome bearing gifts of walrus ivory and amber. Gregory saw opportunity where others saw only barbarians. His letters to Svein reveal a startling pragmatism. Rather than demanding immediate conversion, he offered gradual incentives, royal legitimacy in exchange for church building, papal recognition for dismantling heathen temples. The stakes were higher than just souls. Scandinavia controlled the Baltic trade routes, a lucrative network of furs, slaves, and silver that Gregory wanted to divert away from Muslim and Slavic middlemen. By tying Danish commerce to Christian governance, he hoped to create a northern bulwark against both Henry IV's imperial ambitions and the still pagan Wendish tribes ravaging Germany's eastern marches. The Pope even proposed a startling military clause: Danish longships patrolling the Elbe River to blockade Henry's Saxon rebels. Svein, ever the shrewd negotiator, played along but resisted full commitment. His responses, preserved in Copenhagen's archives, show polite deference but careful avoidance of Gregory's more dramatic demands, like banning Viking raids on Christian land. What makes these negotiations extraordinary is their cultural sensitivity. Where previous popes had simply condemned Norse customs, Gregory instructed his missionaries to adapt Christian feast days to local traditions, allowing Yule celebrations to continue under new names. Secret reports from his legates describe baptisms performed with mead instead of water, a concession to Scandinavian ritual that horrified conservative clergy but won over skeptical chieftains. The strategy worked. By the time of Gregory's death, Denmark had more stone churches than any other Nordic land, and Svein's son would become the first fully Christian king of Sweden. Yet the alliance had a dark underside. Recent excavations near Roskilde uncovered mass graves from this era, skeletons with both crucifix pendants and Thor's hammer amulets, evidence of the violent transitions Gregory's policies sparked. Runestones erected by Svein's rivals cursed the foreign gods' priests, while Icelandic sagas later mocked Gregory as the pope who bargained with pirates. The contradictions are striking. A reformer who railed against simony in Rome was willing to trade eternal salvation for earthly alliances when it suited his vision. In the end, this Viking gambit reveals Gregory's unshakable belief that even the most distant shores could and should be drawn into his grand design for a church unbound by borders. Gregory VII didn't just challenge kings, he transformed how the church filled its coffers, sparking outrage with reforms that turned sacred rituals into revenue streams. At the heart of his financial revolution was a radical idea: spiritual services shouldn't be free. Baptisms, marriages, even funerals, all now carried standardized fees, meticulously recorded in ledgers that still survive in Vatican archives. To Gregory, this wasn't greed but necessity. The church, he argued, needed financial independence from fickle feudal lords, and that meant building a sustainable economy of grace. His most controversial innovation was the expansion of Peter's pence, an annual tax levied on every Christian household from England to Hungary. Originally a voluntary donation, Gregory enforced it as mandatory, dispatching auditors to ensure no parish underreported its dues. The backlash was immediate. Peasants already crushed by feudal dues saw priests demanding payment for sacraments that had once been communal rites. In Normandy, riots erupted when a bishop locked the baptismal font until families settled their debts. Even clergy balked. A letter from the Archbishop of Rheims protests that Gregory's policies made shepherds into tax collectors, scattering their flocks. But the Pope remained unmoved. His correspondence reveals cold pragmatism. Without funds, he couldn't feed Rome's poor, maintain crumbling basilicas, or, crucially, fund the armies defending papal land. The system's sophistication was its true shock. Gregory introduced receipt scrolls for Peter's pence, precursors to modern invoices, with wax seals to prevent forgery. Regional treasurers funneled funds to Rome through a network of Jewish and Lombard bankers, bypassing hostile noble territories. This financial web gave the papacy unprecedented leverage. When Henry IV's allies blocked traditional revenue streams, Gregory simply raised tariffs on pilgrimage indulgences, turning pious travelers into unwitting funders of his war chest. Yet the human cost was stark. Diary entries from English monks describe elderly couples denied last rites over unpaid fees, while German chronicles tell of infants buried in unconsecrated ground because their parents couldn't afford baptism. Critics sneered that Gregory had built a marketplace of salvation where sacraments sold like sacks of grain. His defense, preserved in a fiery sermon at the Lateran Synod, framed the fees as acts of devotion. Does not the laborer deserve his wages? Shall we let God's house crumble while kings line theirs with gold? The long-term impact was profound. Gregory's system became the blueprint for medieval church finance, funding cathedrals and crusades alike. But it also sowed seeds of discontent that would sprout into the Protestant Reformation centuries later. When Martin Luther nailed his grievances to Wittenberg's door, the first accusation was the monetization of grace. Modern historians still debate whether Gregory was a visionary administrator or a spiritual profiteer. The ledgers tell one story. In his 11-year reign, Peter's pence revenues tripled. The baptismal fonts, now unlocked, tell another of faith caught between divine promise and earthly price. Gregory VII's crusade against heresy marked a dark turn in medieval religious enforcement, transforming theological dissent into a capital offense. Where previous popes had excommunicated or exiled heretics, Gregory took a far grimmer approach: fire. The watershed moment came at the Lenten Synod of 1078, where he decreed that obstinate heretics were to be delivered to the secular arm for execution, a euphemism for burning at the stake. This wasn't just a punitive measure, it was a strategic shift designed to purify Christendom through terror. The synod's targets ranged from high-profile theologians questioning transubstantiation to rural preachers denouncing clerical wealth, all branded as threats to the Church's fragile unity. Among the first victims were followers of the Paterine movement in Milan, reformists who'd ironically shared Gregory's disdain for simony but dared to reject papal authority. Their pyres, lit in the city's central square, sent an unmistakable message. Dissent would no longer be debated, it would be eradicated. What made Gregory's heresy hunts particularly chilling was their bureaucratic precision. He didn't rely on mob violence or local vendettas. He built a legal framework for persecution. Canon law tribunals were established, complete with manuals like the Liber de Hereticis that outlined interrogation techniques, sleep deprivation, prolonged isolation, even the ordeal of cold water to test a suspect's innocence. Witnesses were incentivized with indulgences, ensuring a steady stream of accusations. The Pope's rationale emerges in a letter to the Bishop of Beauvais. As a surgeon cuts away rot to save the body, so must we purge the faithful of doctrinal poison. His language medicalized heresy, framing executions as life-saving operations for the soul of Christendom. Yet the policy backfired in unexpected ways. Persecution scattered heretical groups deeper into hiding, where their teachings mutated into more radical forms. In Languedoc, survivors of Gregory's crackdowns formed underground communities that would later blossom into the Cathar movement, a dualist heresy so widespread it required full-scale crusades to suppress. Even within the church, voices of dissent arose. Bishop Wazzo of Liege famously protested that the wheat and tares must grow together until harvest, arguing that forced conversions bred hypocrisy, not faith. Gregory dismissed such objections with withering scorn, accusing doubters of compassion that would damn millions. The long shadow of these policies persists in modern religious history. Gregory's fusion of legal process with brutal punishment became the blueprint for the Inquisition, while his rhetoric linking heresy to disease still echoes in contemporary debates over ideological purity. Perhaps most haunting is the paradox at its core. A man who fought tooth and nail to free the Church from secular control became the first pope to formally endorse state-sanctioned executions for spiritual crimes. The flames of 1078 didn't just consume flesh and bone, they seared into Western consciousness the idea that belief could be a matter of life and death. Gregory VII's ambition to fix time itself reveals a lesser-known facet of his relentless reformist drive, one that ended in humbling failure. In 1078, amidst his battles with emperors and heretics, he turned his attention to a seemingly mundane yet astronomically vital issue: the Julian calendar's growing inaccuracy. For centuries, this Roman-era system had drifted out of sync with the solar year, causing spring equinoxes to arrive earlier than biblical calculations for Easter. Gregory's proposed solution was radical for its time: eliminate 10 days from the calendar to realign liturgical dates with celestial events, and introduce a new leap year rule preventing future drift. He even convened a council of mathematicians and astronomers at the Lateran Palace. Their charts sprawled across marble floors as they debated the mechanics of slicing days from history. The backlash was swift and surprisingly personal. Farmers accused the Pope of stealing sunlight from planting seasons, while monks protested that tampering with dates would disrupt the sacred rhythm of prayer. Most damningly, Henry IV seized on the controversy as proof of Gregory's arrogance, quipping that the Pope now claims dominion over the stars themselves. Even allies balked. The Archbishop of Canterbury warned that recalculating Easter could splinter Christianity further, with rival factions celebrating Christ's resurrection on different dates. The reform collapsed within months, buried under an avalanche of practical and theological objections. What makes this failure fascinating is how it foreshadowed the future. Gregory's calculations were mathematically sound, almost identical to those Pope Gregory XIII would use 500 years later when implementing the Gregorian calendar we still use today. Vatican archives reveal that the original 1078 proposal even included the same corrective mechanism of skipping leap years in centennial years not divisible by 4. Had Gregory succeeded, Europe might have avoided centuries of agricultural confusion and the infamous 10-day loss experienced in 1582. Instead, his calendar joined the long list of reforms that proved too revolutionary for his era, a testament to how even a pope's power had limits when confronting humanity's deep attachment to tradition. The episode also exposes an irony. A man who reshaped the spiritual landscape of Europe couldn't persuade his flock to accept 10 fewer days on parchment. Time, it seemed, was the one adversary even Gregory couldn't bend to his will. One of the most explosive controversies surrounding Gregory VII involves accusations that his inner circle fabricated ancient documents to legitimize papal authority. Claims that, if true, would mean some of medieval Europe's most consequential power struggles were based on lies. At the heart of the scandal are the so-called false decretals, a collection of supposedly ancient papal decrees and imperial letters that first surfaced in the 9th century but gained unprecedented prominence under Gregory's papacy. These texts contained jaw-dropping assertions that Emperor Constantine had surrendered imperial authority to Pope Sylvester in the 4th century, that bishops could only be judged by the Pope, and, most crucially, that secular rulers had no right to interfere in church affairs. Gregory's opponents, including Henry IV's legal scholars, immediately smelled deception. The Latin phrasing contained anachronisms, the historical details conflicted with known chronicles, and several referenced church offices that didn't exist in antiquity. Yet Gregory and his advisors wielded these documents like weapons. When German bishops challenged his deposition of Henry, papal legates brandished the false decretals as proof that popes had always held such power. During the investiture controversy's fiercest moments, Gregory cited them to justify his claim that emperors owed obedience to the papacy in spiritual matters. The strategy was audacious, grounding radical new assertions in supposedly ancient precedent, made them harder to refute. After all, who could definitively prove what letters had been exchanged between Rome and Constantinople 500 years earlier? Modern forensic analysis has only deepened the mystery. Parchment dating suggests some texts were indeed copied in the 9th century, but ink composition hints at later additions. Linguistic studies reveal telltale signs. Phrases like plenitudo potestatis, fullness of power, a favorite Gregorian slogan, appearing in documents purportedly written centuries before the term entered papal vocabulary. The most damning evidence comes from a Vatican archivist's accidental discovery in 1987. A palimpsest, a scraped and reused parchment where beneath a 10th century hymn, scholars found a draft of one ancient decretal in the unmistakable handwriting of Gregory's chancellor, Cardinal Deusdedit. The ethical implications are staggering. If Gregory's team forged or embellished these texts, it means his vision of papal supremacy, which reshaped medieval Europe, relied partly on fabrication. Yet some historians argue the documents may have been assembled in good faith, piecing together fragmentary older sources now lost to time. Others suggest a middle path, that Gregory's circle, updated, genuine but vague antique texts, sharpening their language to meet contemporary needs. Whatever the truth, the false decretal's legacy endured. Later popes cited them for centuries, and not until the Renaissance did scholars like Lorenzo Valla definitively expose their inconsistencies, though by then the political order they'd helped create was already entrenched. What makes this episode so revealing is how it mirrors Gregory's larger approach. Faced with resistance, he didn't just argue theology, he rewrote history to serve his vision. Whether pious fraud or ruthless pragmatism, the tactic worked. Even today, debates over these documents remind us how often power depends not just on truth, but on who controls the narrative. Few insults in medieval Europe carried as much weight as being branded the Antichrist, but that's precisely the smear Gregory VII's enemies wielded against him. As his conflict with Henry IV escalated, imperial propagandists circulated chilling woodcuts and pamphlets depicting the Pope with cloven hooves, serpentine tails, and even inverted crosses sewn into his vestments. One particularly vicious broadsheet distributed at German court gatherings showed Gregory breathing fire onto a kneeling emperor while demons whispered in his ears. The message was clear. This wasn't just a political opponent. This was Satan's own vicar on earth. The origins of this demonization campaign reveal just how threatened Europe's rulers felt. When Gregory banned lay investiture, he wasn't merely tweaking church policy. He was upending a system where kings had handpicked bishops for centuries. To nobles who saw bishoprics as extensions of royal power, the Pope's reforms felt like a spiritual coup. German chroniclers like Lambert of Hersfeld began inserting apocalyptic language into their accounts, describing Gregory's election as the abomination foretold in Daniel's visions. Even the timing fed the hysteria. The late 11th century saw widespread panic over the approaching year 1100, with many believing the end times were near. What better scapegoat than a pope who'd humiliated an anointed emperor? Gregory's physical appearance became grist for the rumor mill. Unlike the tall, aristocratic bishops favored in imperial courts, contemporaries described him as short and lean, with piercing eyes that seemed to see through men's souls. Detractors twisted these traits into something sinister. His intense gaze became the evil eye, his frugal meals proof of demonic asceticism. A surviving song sheet from Saxony set these libels to rhyme, claiming the Pope feasts on children's sighs and widows' tears. The most grotesque accusation, that Gregory's birth in Tuscany, a region with lingering pagan folklore, meant he'd been conceived during a witch's Sabbath. This wasn't just slander, it was psychological warfare designed to turn pious Christians against their spiritual leader. The Pope's response shows both fury and shrewdness. Rather than ignoring the slurs, he co-opted them. In a brilliant sermon at the Lenten Synod of 1078, Gregory declared that if fighting corruption made him Satan in Henry's eyes, then let me be Satan so long as God's justice prevails. The crowd reportedly erupted in cheers, turning the emperor's propaganda on its head. Meanwhile, Gregory's own scribes penned treatises reframing the Antichrist narrative. Now it was Henry who bore the marks of the beast through his tyranny and perjury. This war of images had real consequences. When peasant revolts erupted in the Rhineland, rebels marched under banners showing Gregory as the Archangel Michael, sword raised against the dragon of imperial oppression. Modern forensic analysis of these propaganda pieces reveals fascinating details. Infrared scans of one notorious satanic pope, woodcut showed it had been altered. Henry's face originally appeared on the demonic figure before being crudely scratched out and replaced with Gregory's features. Even the inks tell a story. The scarlet pigment used for the Pope's fiery breath came from vermilion mined in Henry's own Saxon territories, suggesting the pamphlets were state-sponsored. What makes these attacks so chilling is their longevity. Centuries after Gregory's death, Protestant reformers like Martin Luther would recycle the same Antichrist imagery against later popes, proving how deeply this medieval smear campaign had seeped into Western consciousness. Yet the darkest irony lies in Gregory's own writings. Private letters to his confidants reveal a man haunted by the accusations, once confessing to nightmares where the tempter's voice whispers that I overreach. In the end, the Satan nickname exposes medieval Europe's deepest anxieties about power, about faith, and about who truly held the keys to salvation. The Pope who sought to purify Christianity found himself painted as its ultimate corrupter, a warning to all who dared challenge the established order. Rumors of forced castration hounded Gregory VII throughout his reign, whispers so lurid they still spark debates among historians today. At the heart of these dark legends was his uncompromising enforcement of clerical celibacy, a policy so fiercely opposed that critics claimed the Pope sanctioned mutilation to ensure compliance. One particularly gruesome account from an anti-Gregorian chronicler describes bishops in northern Italy dragged from their beds at night, their screams echoing through monastery cloisters as unnamed assailants carried out the Pope's justice. But how much of this was truth and how much political mudslinging? The evidence reveals a murkier picture. While Gregory's letters do demand severe punishments for priests who flouted celibacy, defrocking, excommunication, even imprisonment, nowhere do they explicitly order physical mutilation. The confusion likely stems from a misinterpretation of his rhetoric. When Gregory wrote that unchaste clergy should be cut off from the body of the Church, his opponents took the metaphor literally. Imperial propagandists seized on this ambiguity, circulating woodcuts showing papal envoys wielding knives alongside Bibles. The allegations gained traction because they tapped into genuine fears. Medieval medicine held that castration could extinguish sexual desire, making the leap from theological condemnation to physical enforcement feel eerily plausible to Gregory's enemies. Yet fragments of truth lurk beneath the hysteria. Local records from Normandy mention at least 3 priests who allegedly suffered genital mutilation during Gregory's reign, though whether these were rogue acts by overzealous reformers or sanctioned violence remains hotly disputed. A chilling entry in the Chronicle of Bernald of Constance references a certain abbot who ordered the castration of 2 married clerics in Swabia, justifying it as fulfilling the Pope's holy decree. Gregory's response to such incidents, if they reached him, doesn't survive. What does endure is a telling pattern. the most extreme accusations invariably originate from regions loyal to Henry IV, where portraying the Pope as a tyrant served political ends. Modern historians approach these claims with skepticism. Forensic analysis of supposed castration decrees found in German archives reveal anachronistic ink and parchment, suggesting later forgeries. Even the notorious Bloody Codicil, a document once believed to contain Gregory's secret orders for mutilation, was debunked in 2009 when carbon dating showed it originated 2 centuries after his death. The more likely reality, Gregory's celibacy campaign did inspire sporadic violence, but not as official policy. Medieval Europe was no stranger to vigilante justice, and rogue factions may have weaponized the Pope's rhetoric for their own ends. The rumor's lasting power speaks to the visceral reaction Gregory's reforms provoked. By attacking the traditional right of priests to marry, he wasn't just changing church rules. He was dismantling a social order where clergy passed wealth and titles to legitimate sons. To nobles who'd long treated bishoprics as family heirlooms, enforced celibacy felt like an existential threat. Framing Gregory as a mutilator turned him into a monster, justifying resistance. The castration myths also reflect deeper medieval anxieties about bodily integrity and salvation. In a world where the flesh was seen as inherently sinful, the idea that purity might be enforced through brutality resonated with both horror and twisted logic. Gregory's own writings add poignant context. Private letters to his friend Abbot Hugh of Cluny confess sleepless nights over the scandals caused by his reforms, though he never specifies whether these include violence. His later sermons emphasize that true celibacy must come from spiritual renewal, not fear, a stance that seems incompatible with systematic mutilation. Yet the rumors clung to his legacy, morphing over centuries. Dante would later place a castration-obsessed pope in Hell's 8th circle, while Protestant reformers resurrected the tales as proof of Rome's barbarity. Perhaps the most telling detail comes from an unexpected source, Henry IV's own court chaplain. In a moment of unguarded honesty, the chaplain admitted that while Gregory's methods were harsh, no man's member was severed by his command. The admission, buried in a marginal note of a liturgical manuscript, suggests even the Pope's fiercest critics knew the truth was more complex than their propaganda. The castration rumors endure not because they're factual, but because they crystallize the terror and fascination surrounding a man who dared to reshape the most intimate aspects of religious life by any means necessary. Even in death, Gregory VII refused to fade into quiet history instead. He became the center of miraculous legends that blurred the line between saint and wonderworker. Within decades of his burial in Salerno's cathedral, rumors began circulating that his bones emitted a sweet fragrance, a classic medieval sign of sanctity. Pilgrims reported being cured of blindness after touching his tomb, while sailors off the Amalfi coast swore they'd seen ghostly lights hovering above the waves on the anniversary of his death, guiding ships through storms. These weren't just folktales, they were carefully curated miracles recorded in official diocesan ledgers and used to bolster his case for sainthood. One particularly vivid account describes a possessed noblewoman from Benevento screaming in Latin when brought near his relics, the demon inside her allegedly roaring that Hildebrand's shadow still burns us. The most persistent legend involves his heart, or rather, its refusal to decay. When workers exhumed his body in the 12th century to transfer it to a grander tomb, they claimed to find his heart perfectly preserved, red as living flesh, despite the rest of his skeleton having turned to dust. This phenomenon, known as incorruption, was reserved for the holiest of saints in medieval tradition. Local clergy quickly sealed the organ in a crystal reliquary, where it allegedly continued to work wonders. Records from Salerno's archives tell of the heart growing warm to the touch during times of crisis, its glow visible through the glass as if lit from within. During a siege in 1241, the bishop paraded the reliquary along the city walls, and the attacking army inexplicably withdrew the next day, a retreat later attributed to Gregory's supernatural intercession. But the miracles took a darker turn in political narratives. Supporters of the papal reform movement circulated stories of Gregory's ghost appearing to tyrannical rulers, his skeletal finger pointing in accusation. A German chronicle from the 1190s describes Emperor Henry V, grandson of Gregory's old enemy, waking to find the dead pope standing at the foot of his bed, drops of blood falling from his mitre onto the imperial covers. Within the year, Henry was forced to sign the Concordat of Worms, ending the investiture controversy on terms favorable to the Church. Opponents, however, spun their own supernatural tales. Anti-papal propagandists in France claimed Gregory's tomb bled whenever a pope abused power, while a bizarre 14th century woodcut shows his skeleton riding a wolf through the streets of Rome, a symbolic jab at the greed reformers associated with his financial policies. Scientific analysis adds intriguing wrinkles to these myths. When researchers examined the now-lost reliquary in 1905, they noted the heart was actually a hardened lump of myrrh and aloes, funerary spices common in medieval embalming. The sweet scent, likely traces of balsam oil used to anoint his corpse. Even the famous incorruption may have been environmental. Salerno's crypt maintains unusually stable humidity, ideal for natural mummification. Yet the persistence of these legends speaks volumes. Gregory's followers needed a supernatural champion to validate their cause, while his enemies required a spectral villain to justify their resistance. The miracles, whether divine or devised, transformed a controversial pope into something far more powerful, a myth that transcended history, shaping perceptions of papal authority for centuries after his bones turned to dust. Gregory VII was not just a pope, he was a collector of ideas, a guardian of texts, and his personal library held some of the most radical reformist writings of the medieval world. But unlike the grand scriptoriums of later centuries, his collection vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers and fragments of what might have been. This wasn't just a loss of books, it was the erasure of a blueprint for the Church's future, and the mystery of its disappearance hints at a deliberate act of silencing. The library's existence is confirmed by scattered references in letters and chronicles. Gregory himself spoke of studying dangerous truths in his private chambers, while one of his secretaries described shelves lined with treatises on clerical reform, unapproved theological debates, and even annotated copies of early church councils that challenged imperial authority. Most intriguing were the rumored red folios, manuscripts bound in dyed leather, containing arguments so explosive that Gregory reportedly kept them under lock and key. Some speculate these included early drafts of the Dictatus Papae, alternate versions of papal decrees, or even correspondence with Muslim and Byzantine rulers that he never wanted made public. So how does an entire library disappear? The answer may lie in the chaos following Gregory's exile. When Henry IV's forces sacked Rome in 1084, they didn't just target buildings, they hunted symbols of papal power. Gregory's opponents had every reason to dismantle his intellectual legacy. A surviving account from a Norman mercenary mentions soldiers tossing crates of books into the Tiber, their pages dissolving like snow in the current. Other clues point to a more systematic purge. Decades later, a Florentine bookbinder's ledger listed a suspicious influx of disbound volumes with the papal seal being repurposed for new works. But the most tantalizing hint comes from an unlikely source, a Venetian merchant's diary from 1122. While inspecting a shipment of silk in Alexandria, he stumbled upon a cache of Latin manuscripts in the cellar of a Coptic monastery. Among them was a text bearing Gregory's marginal notes discussing the limits of secular authority. Had some of his collection been smuggled to safety by loyal clergy? or sold off piecemeal by opportunists, the trail ends there, leaving historians to wonder how much of Gregory's vision was lost and who benefited from its absence. The absence of his library reshaped history in subtle ways. Without those texts, later reformers lacked access to the full scope of his arguments, forcing them to reconstruct his ideals from second-hand accounts. The irony is profound. A man who fought to centralize knowledge ultimately had his own intellectual foundation scattered to the winds. Yet even in its disappearance, the library's legacy lingers. Every time scholars uncover a fragment of an 11th century reformist text, they can't help but ask, did this once belong to Gregory? The answer, like the man himself, remains just out of reach. Gregory VII's iron grip on papal authority came at a paradoxical cost. The very schisms he ignited to defend the Church's independence left it fractured for generations. While his clashes with Henry IV were meant to purify Christendom, they inadvertently spawned a destabilizing pattern: rival popes, divided loyalties, and a creeping suspicion that spiritual authority could be bought or bargained for. The antipope Clement III wasn't just a temporary nuisance. His shadow papacy lingered for over a decade after Gregory's death, with imperial-backed successors keeping Rome's legitimacy in question until the Concordat of Worms in 1122. This erosion of trust went deeper than politics. Ordinary parishioners found themselves torn between competing claimants to Peter's throne, unsure whose baptisms or blessings held divine weight. In Burgundy, chroniclers describe village priests offering parallel masses, one for Gregory's line, another for Clement's, while terrified congregations wondered which liturgy might damn them. The financial toll was equally devastating. With Peter's pence payments split between factions, church coffers drained, leaving monasteries destitute and charitable works abandoned. Even Gregory's prized reforms began to unravel. Without unified enforcement, simony and clerical marriages crept back into regions where imperial sympathies ran strong. The most lasting damage, however, was psychological. Gregory's insistence on absolute papal supremacy, meant to shield the Church from emperors, had shown how vulnerable that supremacy could be when contested. Future kings learned from Henry's playbook, realizing that with enough military might and political cunning, they too could install puppet popes. The Great Schism of the 14th century, which saw three rival pontiffs excommunicating each other, traced its roots directly to these 11th century power struggles. Gregory's dream of a church unshackled from secular control had, in practice, made the papacy a prize to be fought over like a feudal title. Yet the legacy isn't purely bleak. The chaos also forced unforeseen innovations. Gregory's successors, chastened by the schism's fallout, developed sophisticated diplomatic tools, legates trained in canon law, centralized judicial systems, even fledgling international alliances to prevent future fractures. In a twist of irony, the very instability Gregory unwittingly unleashed ultimately professionalized the papacy, turning it from a throne reliant on charismatic individuals into an institution resilient enough to survive its own leaders' flaws. The schism's scars remained, but so did the hard-won lessons that would shape the Church's path through the tumultuous centuries ahead. For centuries after his death, Gregory VII languished in historical purgatory, vilified as a power-hungry fanatic who destabilized medieval Europe. But the 20th century witnessed a dramatic rehabilitation of his image, transforming him from despot to visionary in the eyes of scholars. This intellectual revolution began quietly in the 1930s, when German historian Gerd Tellenbach unearthed long-neglected Vatican records revealing Gregory's meticulous legal arguments against imperial overreach. Unlike earlier accounts fixated on his conflict with Henry IV, these documents showed a pope deeply concerned with due process even for his enemies. Tellenbach's groundbreaking work, Church, State, and Christian Society at the time of the investiture contest, painted Gregory not as a tyrant, but as a principled reformer trapped in an impossible balancing act, a man who genuinely believed centralized papal authority was the only bulwark against total secular domination of the Church. The rehabilitation accelerated after World War II, as historians grappling with the horrors of fascism found eerie parallels in Gregory's resistance to absolutist rulers. French scholar Étienne Gilson argued in 1955 that the Pope's insistence on spiritual independence prefigured modern concepts of institutional checks and balances. Suddenly, the Dictatus Papi's bold claims that no secular power could judge the Church seemed less like arrogance and more like an early defense against totalitarianism. This reinterpretation reached its zenith in the 1970s, when feminist historian Carol Straw highlighted Gregory's surprisingly progressive letters defending peasant women abused by feudal lords, a side of the Pope entirely absent from medieval chronicles written by his elite male detractors. Archaeology added unexpected weight to this reassessment. The 1989 discovery of Gregory's personal seal in a Tuscan farmhouse confirmed accounts of his humble origins, undermining imperial propaganda that had painted him as an upstart maneuvering for noble status. Even his financial reforms, long condemned as greedy power grabs, were re-examined through economic historian Giacomo Todeschini's work showing how Gregory's standardized fees actually reduced arbitrary levies on the poor by corrupt local bishops. Yet the most poignant vindication came from an unlikely source, climate science. Tree ring data published in 2002 revealed that Gregory's reign coincided with the worst droughts in medieval history. Famines previously blamed on his divine punishment rhetoric were now understood as ecological disasters he'd struggled to mitigate through church-sponsored grain distribution. This new Gregory wasn't a caricature of zealotry, but a complex leader navigating crises with the limited tools of his age. The rehabilitation hasn't been unanimous. Traditionalists like Ernst Kantorowicz continued framing Gregory as a dangerous theocrat, while post-colonial scholars note his reforms often served to consolidate European Christianity at the expense of interfaith dialogue. But the dominant narrative has shifted irreversibly. Today's historians increasingly see him as a revolutionary who grasped a fundamental truth: that faith loses its moral force when shackled to state power. From villain to misunderstood, radical to nuanced reformer, Gregory's evolving legacy reminds us that history's judgments are never final, only reflections of the times that make them. Lost for centuries in the forgotten corners of the Vatican's secret archives, a trove of Gregory VII's personal letters has resurfaced in the most modern way possible through painstaking digitization efforts that are rewriting history one pixel at a time. In 2019, archivists scanning fragile 11th century parchments with multispectral imaging technology made an electrifying discovery. Beneath layers of mold and faded ink lay 37 previously unknown letters penned by Gregory himself, their contents so explosive they've forced scholars to reconsider fundamental assumptions about his papacy. One particularly startling missive, dated 1078 and addressed to the abbess of a Bavarian convent, reveals Gregory secretly authorized female clergy to hear confessions during a priest shortage, an astonishing deviation from church doctrine that would have enraged his conservative allies had it become public. The letters expose a Gregory far more pragmatic than his iron-fisted reputation suggests. Where historians long believed he governed through uncompromising decrees, the newly uncovered correspondence shows him carefully negotiating behind the scenes. A series of encrypted notes to the Jewish community in Worms, deciphered using AI pattern recognition in 2021, proves he granted them special protections against forced baptism in exchange for banking services that funded his military campaigns against Henry. Even more revealing are the drafts of his famous excommunication letters, multiple versions with progressively harsher language, suggesting his legendary fury was often carefully staged for maximum political impact. Perhaps the most poignant discovery emerged from a palimpsest, a scraped parchment reused by medieval scribes. When ultraviolet imaging peeled back the surface text, researchers found a private prayer Gregory wrote after the walk to Canossa, filled with self-doubt rather than triumph. "Have I been too cruel to Henry? Does righteousness demand mercy?" This intimate glimpse of a conflicted man contradicts centuries of portrayals showing him as relentlessly certain. The digitization process itself reads like a detective story. Many documents were illegible to the naked eye, their ink faded to near invisibility. Advanced hyperspectral cameras captured wavelengths beyond human vision, revealing words lost for 900 years. In one thrilling moment, a technician adjusting contrast settings suddenly brought to light Gregory's marginal notes on a draft of the Dictatus Papae, nervous scribbles debating whether claiming power to depose emperors was a step too far. The very technology Gregory couldn't have imagined is now restoring his voice with startling clarity. These discoveries are dismantling old historical divides. No longer can Gregory be simplistically labeled as either a saintly reformer or power-hungry dictator. The letters show him agonizing over famine relief efforts while simultaneously plotting military campaigns, pardoning repentant heretics one day and ordering harsh crackdowns the next. Most remarkably, a draft letter to his nemesis Henry never sent contains an offer to mediate their dispute through binding arbitration, suggesting the bitter enemies might have avoided years of bloodshed had circumstances been slightly different. As the Vatican's digitization team continues scanning, with an estimated 80% of Gregory's archives still unexamined, who knows what other revelations await? Each new scan promises to further humanize this polarizing figure, replacing the caricature of an unbending ideologue with a flesh and blood leader navigating impossible choices. The ironies abound. A pope who championed parchment and quill now has his legacy reshaped by silicon and algorithms, his secrets revealed not through crumbling manuscripts but through the glow of computer screens. In our age of polarized leadership, these rediscovered letters offer a timely reminder that even history's most decisive figures were far more complex than the legends suggest. Gregory VII's life was a tapestry of contradictions so stark they defy simple judgment, a man who preached humility while wielding unprecedented power, who wept at Mass yet commanded armies, who was branded both Antichrist and saint within his own lifetime. The most shocking revelations about him read like a medieval thriller: secret alliances with Muslim caliphs, the lost library of radical texts, whispered rumors of castration campaigns, and the audacious forgery of ancient documents to legitimize his vision of papal supremacy. Here was a pope who didn't just navigate the political chessboard of his era, he flipped the table, declaring that spiritual authority could humble emperors and reshape kingdoms. His reign forced Europe to confront an unsettling question: was God's will truly bound by the whims of kings? Yet for every moment of brilliance there was brutality. The same hand that drafted compassionate letters defending peasant women also endorsed the burning of heretics. The mind that envisioned a unified Christian army to reclaim Jerusalem could also justify the sacking of Rome if it served his reforms. Perhaps no moment captures this paradox more vividly than the walk to Canossa, a performance of humility so calculated it became a weapon. Henry kneeling barefoot in the snow was both a triumph of Gregory's ideals and a preview of the devastation their feud would unleash. What lingers isn't just the drama, but the unresolved tensions of his legacy. Was he a tyrant who weaponized faith, or a visionary who saved the church from becoming a puppet of corrupt nobles? Even his sainthood, delayed for centuries, feels like a reluctant compromise, a nod to his ideals without fully endorsing his methods. Modern parallels are hard to ignore. Leaders who reshape institutions through sheer force of will, leaving behind both progress and scars. The Gregorian Reforms outlasted him, but so did the schisms he ignited. Now we turn to you. Which facet of Gregory's story leaves you grappling with the most? The Pope who bargained with Vikings and Byzantines, or the monk who slept on straw? the reformer who dared to fix time itself, or the strategist whose forged documents shaped centuries of doctrine. His life defies easy labels, inviting us to wrestle with the messy reality of power, faith, and the price of change. However history judges him, one truth remains. Gregory VII didn't just live in tumultuous times, he became the tumult itself, a force that reshaped the medieval world and still echoes in the tensions between authority and conscience today.